I never thought I'd die surrounded by gold. Not real gold, trophy gold, that strange alloy they played over hollow dreams so the cameras catch the light just right. But there I was, pressed against the curved glass of a display case holding the 2014 FIFA World Cup trophy, my breath fogging the surface while something shuffled through the corridor outside. The scratching hadn't started yet. That came later. And when it did, everything we'd built inside that room, every rule, every alliance, every lie we told ourselves about safety, unraveled faster than I thought possible. My name is Joel Mancini. I was a facilities coordinator for FIFA's Zurich headquarters. The kind of mid-level, nobody who kept climate controls calibrated and made sure the motion sensor lighting didn't glitch during VIP tours. I knew every hallway, every locked door, every maintenance shaft in the building. That knowledge saved my life 6 times in the first 48 hours. After that, it almost killed me. The outbreak reached Zurich on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were my light days equipment audits, inventory reports, the kind of bureaucratic noise that let me eat lunch at my desk and leave by 5. I was reviewing a ventilation log when Katrin Hofer from Communications ran past my office without her shoes. That detail stuck. Katrin was the kind of woman who color coordinated her heels with her lanyard. Seeing her barefoot on institutional carpet was like seeing a traffic light turn purple. Wrong in a way that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct. I followed her. She was heading for the east stairwell, and by the time I caught up, she'd barricaded herself in the second-floor women's restroom. Through the door, I could hear her hyperventilating. "Katrin, it's Joel. Facilities. They're eating Marcus." Her voice was flat, clinical, like she was reading a weather report about the end of everything. "In the lobby, 3 of them. They came through the visitor entrance and they're eating Marcus Brandt, and his neck is open, and I can see the tile through the hole in his throat." I didn't believe her. Not fully, not yet. But my body believed her. My hands were already shaking when I pulled out my access card and swiped into the maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the east wing. I took the service elevator to the ground floor and cracked the utility door just wide enough to see the lobby atrium. Marcus Brandt was indeed on the floor. He was the senior security officer for the building 220 pounds, former Swiss military police. The kind of man who made you feel safe by existing. Now he was a geography of red across white marble. 3 figures crouched over him, their movements jerky and arrhythmic, like marionettes operated by someone who'd never seen a human body move. One of them raised its head, and I saw the face of a woman I recognized, Elise, the evening receptionist. Her jaw hung at an angle that meant the hinge was broken, and her eyes had the milky vacancy of expired yogurt. I sealed the door. My hands left sweat prints on the metal handle. The next 4 hours were chaos compressed into a series of decisions I barely remember making. I collected Katrin. I found Diego Rojas, a visiting technician from the Buenos Aires office, hiding under a conference table on the 3rd floor. We picked up twin sisters Noor and Layla Kadira, who worked in the archival department and had locked themselves in a file storage room with nothing but a letter opener and a fire extinguisher between them. The 5 of us moved through the building like a slow pulse, clearing floors, sealing fire doors, avoiding the wet sounds coming from the lower levels. It was Diego who suggested the trophy room. FIFA's official exhibition space occupied the building's interior core. No exterior windows, reinforced walls designed to protect millions in irreplaceable sporting heritage, a single steel-reinforced entrance, and a climate control system I could operate manually. It was a vault dressed up as a museum. We sealed ourselves inside at 6:47 p.m. The display lights were still on, casting warm halogen over decades of World Cup history. Gold gleamed from every surface. For a moment, surrounded by all that triumphant metal, I almost felt safe. That feeling lasted 11 hours. The trophy room was never designed for habitation, but it had advantages no office or conference room could match. The walls were poured concrete reinforced with steel mesh, blast-resistant, designed to withstand everything from earthquakes to terrorist attacks. The entrance was a single door with a magnetic lock I could control from an interior panel. Climate systems maintained a constant 18 degrees Celsius, with 40% humidity to preserve the artifacts. The air was clean, recirculated through HEPA filters that hummed behind recessed panels. It smelled like controlled absence. No dust, no mold, no organic decay. We had space for roughly 30 people if they stood. For 5 of us, it was almost luxurious. The exhibition floor covered approximately 400 square meters, divided into themed alcoves celebrating each World Cup tournament from 1930 forward. Glass display cases held trophies, medals, match balls, jerseys, and enough memorabilia to furnish a dozen museums. The centerpiece, the current FIFA World Cup trophy, 18-karat gold over solid sterling, sat on a motorized pedestal in the room's exact center, rotating slowly under a dedicated spotlight. Diego stared at it with the reverence of a man who'd grown up in Buenos Aires worshiping Maradona. "If we die in here," he said quietly, "at least we die in church." Nobody laughed. Noor sat against the base of a 1966 England display, her arms wrapped around her knees. Layla was beside her, shoulder to shoulder, their postures mirroring each other, the way twins' bodies sometimes do, unconscious synchronization, a biological echo. Katrine had found a staff bathroom hidden behind a maintenance panel I'd shown her, and she'd been in there for 20 minutes. I took inventory. The room had no food supply. It was a museum space, not a break room. We had whatever was in our pockets and bags. Diego had a protein bar and a half-liter water bottle. Noor had a bag of dried apricots she kept in her desk and had grabbed reflexively during our evacuation. Layla had nothing. Katrine had a full thermos of coffee and 2 packets of biscuits she'd been saving for her afternoon break. I had my maintenance toolkit, my access card, my phone with 38% battery, and a pocket knife I kept for opening cable housing. Total food supply, enough for perhaps one day if we rationed carefully. Water was the more immediate concern. I knew the climate control system pulled moisture from the air, and the condensation reservoir behind the eastern wall panel held roughly 4 liters at any given time. It was distilled, clean, and constantly replenished. I showed the others how to access it, and Noor's expression shifted from terrified to something almost resembling hope. "So we have water," she said. "Indefinitely? As long as the building has power. The system's on the municipal grid with a diesel backup generator in the basement. If the grid holds, we're fine. If it drops, the generator kicks in automatically. It carries enough fuel for roughly 72 hours. Diego did the math faster than I expected. 3 days. Then the water stops, the air stops, and the locks on that door might fail. The lock defaults to sealed position on power loss, I corrected. We'd be locked in, not exposed. Locked in a sealed room with no air circulation, Layla said. That's not better. She was right, and I didn't argue. Instead, I walked the perimeter, checking every panel, every seam, every inch of wall for structural compromise. The room was immaculate. Whatever was happening in the rest of the building, and from the muffled sounds bleeding through the concrete, A great deal was happening. This space remained inviolate. At 10 p.m., we killed the display lights to conserve power and sat in the emergency glow of 2 battery-operated exit signs. The trophies became silhouettes, dark shapes on their pedestals, like sentinels standing watch over a congregation of the afraid. The rotating pedestal for the main trophy kept turning in the dark, its motor barely audible, a soft mechanical heartbeat. Katrine finally emerged from the bathroom. Her eyes were swollen but dry. She sat beside me and spoke the first honest sentence that any of us had managed since we'd sealed the door. "How long before someone comes for us?" I told her I didn't know. That was the first truth. The second truth, that I wasn't sure anyone was left to come, I kept behind my teeth. Sleep came in shifts, negotiated without formal agreement. Diego took the first watch by default. He was the most alert, the most physically capable. A compact man with a mechanic's hands and the restless energy of someone who couldn't sit still even in crisis. He positioned himself by the door with a fire extinguisher he'd pulled from a wall bracket, holding it like a club. I drifted into something that wasn't quite sleep around midnight. The concrete floor was cold through my trousers, and every time my body began to relax, a sound from beyond the walls would jolt me back. Thumping, dragging. Once a scream that cut off with surgical abruptness. The building was alive with violence, and we were the still center of its turning. I woke fully at 3 a.m. to find Noor sitting beside the 1958 Brazil display, reading the placard by the dim glow of her phone screen. She'd turned the brightness to minimum, and the light painted her face in pale blue. Pele was 17, she whispered when she noticed me watching. 17 years old when he won his first World Cup. Imagine being 17 and holding the world. Imagine being 34 and hiding from it, I replied. She almost smiled. Almost. Joel, can I ask you something? Yes. The maintenance corridors you used to get us here, do they connect to the outside? They did. A service tunnel ran from the basement mechanical room to an external access point near the loading dock on the building's north face. I'd walked it 100 times during routine inspections. It was narrow, unlit, and lined with cable runs and pipe housings, but it was passable. They might, I said, choosing my words with care. But the basement is below the lobby. That's where the worst of it seemed concentrated. Seemed. You don't actually know. No, I don't. She turned off her phone, and the darkness reclaimed her features. We can't stay here forever, Joel. You know that. Eventually this room becomes a coffin with better decor. She was right. The calculus was straightforward. Our food supply gave us perhaps 30 hours. The generator gave us 72 at the outside. And even if both held, dehydration and starvation would erode our capacity to move, think, or fight long before rescue materialized, if it materialized at all. Every hour we waited reduced our physical ability to leave. But every hour also increased our information. By morning, the sounds from outside had changed. The frantic chaos of the first night had subsided into something more organized, rhythmic footfalls, periodic impacts, the behavioral patterns of infected who'd finished feeding and begun the restless patrol that survivors on social media had been documenting for days before the networks went dark. They moved in loose circuits, attracted by sound, repelled by nothing I'd observed. They didn't tire, they didn't sleep. They inhabited the building the way water fills a vessel completely, patiently, without ambition or retreat. At 7 a.m. by Diego's watch, I accessed the building's internal camera system through a maintenance terminal hidden behind a panel near the northeast corner. The terminal was hardwired, low power, originally installed for security monitoring during overnight hours. Most cameras were dark, damaged, or obstructed, but 3 still transmitted. Camera 12 showed the main lobby, empty now except for the stain where Marcus had fallen and the overturned security desk. Camera 19 covered the second-floor east corridor. 2 figures stood motionless in the hallway, facing opposite directions, their postures slack, heads tilted at listening angles. Camera 23 showed the basement mechanical room, clear from what I could see, though the camera's angle was limited. I called Diego over. He studied the screens, his jaw working as he processed. "The basement looks passable," he said. "1 camera, 1 angle. We can't see the full space. But the corridor from here to the basement stairwell, can we map it?" I could. I knew the route by memory, and the building's fire safety schematics were stored on the terminal's local drive. I pulled them up. A maze of corridors, stairwells, and utility passages, marked with exits, extinguisher locations, and critically door positions. Every door between us and the basement was a fire door with a mechanical latch. No power required to open, no power required to close. We had a route. What we lacked was certainty about what waited along it. Katrine refused to leave. She said it calmly, without hysteria, sitting cross-legged beneath the display of the 1990 World Cup match ball. And the steadiness of her refusal was more disturbing than panic would have been. I watched a man I've worked beside for 3 years get disassembled like furniture. I'm not walking back into that building. Diego crouched in front of her. "Katrine, we have maybe 1 day of food. The generator?" I heard the calculations. I understand arithmetic. I'm not leaving this room. Layla tried next, her approach gentler, her voice the practiced calm of someone who'd spent years mediating archival disputes between departments. "No one's asking you to go first. We stay together. We move carefully. Joel knows the route. Joel knows the hallways. Joel doesn't know what's standing in them now." I couldn't argue with her logic. She was operating from a perfectly rational assessment of risk. The room was sealed. The room was safe. The room was known. Everything beyond the door was unknown. And unknown meant potentially lethal. The flaw in her reasoning was temporal. The room's safety was degrading. A countdown, she acknowledged intellectually, but couldn't metabolize emotionally. Fear had locked her to the present tense. Nor solved it. Not through persuasion, but through demonstration. She packed her bag, tightened her shoelaces, and walked to the door. "I'm going. Anyone who wants to come, come. Anyone who doesn't, I understand. But I'd rather die trying to reach daylight than suffocate in a trophy case." The sentence hung in the filtered air. Diego stood up. Layla followed. I moved to the door panel and began the unlocking sequence. Katrine watched us line up, and I saw the moment her isolation terror overrode her movement terror. She stood, smoothed her blouse, a gesture so normal it ached, and joined the back of the line without another word. I unsealed the door at 8:14 a.m. The corridor beyond was empty, lit by emergency strips that cast everything in the amber of perpetual sunset. The air was different out here, warmer, humid, carrying the faint, sweet rot that would become the olfactory signature of every infected space I'd ever enter. I hadn't smelled it the day before. Its presence meant the building's main ventilation was failing, that the filters were overwhelmed, that the infection's biological byproducts were saturating the atmosphere. We moved in single file. I led, carrying my toolkit in one hand and the pocket knife in the other, a laughable weapon. But its weight in my palm was a tether to agency. Diego brought up the rear with the fire extinguisher. Between us, the three women moved close enough to touch, their footsteps careful, their breathing controlled. The route to the basement stairwell required traversing 40 meters of fourth-floor corridor, descending via the northeast service stairs, crossing the third-floor mechanical bridge, and taking the secondary stairwell down to basement level. I'd mapped it on the terminal, memorized the door positions, counted the steps. What I couldn't map was sound our sound. 5 people moving through a concrete corridor generate footfalls, fabric rustle, breathing, the involuntary sounds of fear that no amount of discipline can fully suppress. We made it 20 meters before Diego hissed a warning. Ahead, where the corridor bent toward the stairwell, a shadow moved against the wall. Not a human shadow, wrong proportions. The head too far forward, the shoulders hunched at an angle that suggested the cervical spine had reorganized itself around new priorities. I pressed the group against the wall and waited. The figure emerged from the bend. It was a man in a custodial uniform. Henrik, I realized. The night janitor who'd worked the building for 11 years. His face was a ruin. His mouth opened and closed in rhythmic cycles, producing a clicking sound that I would later learn was a form of echolocation, a rudimentary biological sonar that the infected developed within hours of turning. He moved down the corridor away from us, his path mechanical, his clicking steady as a metronome. We waited until the sound faded. Then we moved. The northeast stairwell door opened silently. I'd personally oiled its hinges 2 weeks prior during routine maintenance. Small mercies. Invisible preparations for catastrophes we never anticipated. The stairwell was vertical silence. Emergency lighting painted each landing in isolated pools, leaving the spaces between in shadow thick enough to feel like texture. We descended single file, my hand on the railing, each step placed deliberately at the edge where metal met wall, the quietest contact point. Diego had figured this out independently, and behind me I could hear the others adapting, learning the geometry of stealth. 3rd floor. The mechanical bridge was a service walkway that spanned the building's central atrium at ceiling height, a maintenance access route for the HVAC system that most employees never knew existed. It was narrow, single file only, with mesh flooring that offered a direct view of the atrium 3 stories below. I stopped the group before stepping onto the bridge and looked down. The atrium was occupied. Not heavily, I counted 7 figures distributed across the open floor plan, each standing in the peculiar stillness I was beginning to understand as their default state. They weren't dormant. Their heads made small rotational adjustments, tracking sounds imperceptible to human ears. One of them stood directly below the bridge, head tilted upward, milky eyes fixed on the mesh flooring above. "It can't see us," I whispered. "The lighting up here is off. We're in shadow." "Can it hear us?" Diego asked, his voice barely a vibration. "We're about to find out." The bridge was 12 meters long, mesh flooring. Every step would produce a faint metallic ring that, in the silence of the dead building, might as well be a bell. I considered our options. Go back and find another route through corridors we hadn't scouted, or cross here and accept the risk. Nor made the decision for us. She removed her shoes, handed them to Layla, and stepped onto the mesh in stocking feet. Her passage was nearly silent. The mesh flexed under her weight, but produced no ring, no impact sound. She reached the other side in 20 seconds and turned, beckoning. We followed her method. Shoes off, carried in hands, crossing the bridge in sock-footed silence, while the infected stood below like congregants in a cathedral of ruin. The mesh was cold against my feet, and through the gaps I could see the upturned face of the figure below, its mouth working in that slow, rhythmic cycle. It didn't react. We reached the far side, and I sealed the access door behind us with a maintenance latch. The secondary stairwell took us to the basement. Here the lighting was different industrial fluorescents, half of them dead. The survivors buzzing with an electrical complaint that masked our footsteps. The basement was a warren of mechanical rooms, storage bays, and utility corridors, all connected by a main artery that ran the building's length from south to north, terminating at the loading dock access tunnel. Camera 23 had shown the mechanical room as clear, but the camera's range was limited to a 30-degree arc. The rest of the basement was unmapped territory. We moved through it in stages, clearing each junction before advancing to the next. Diego and I developed a wordless system. I would advance to a corner, listen, peer around, and either gesture forward or hold up a closed fist. The women stayed between us, compact, disciplined. Their fear converted into precision. It was Layla who heard it first. She grabbed my arm with a grip that would leave bruises and pointed toward a storage bay to our left. The door was ajar, and from inside came a sound I hadn't encountered before, a wet, rhythmic tearing, like someone slowly pulling apart a phone book that had been soaked in water. I looked. Inside the bay, 2 infected crouched over what had been the building's facilities manager, my direct supervisor, a woman named Greta Volz. They were methodical in their work, operating with the patient focus of artisans. I pulled back and redirected the group down a parallel corridor, adding 4 minutes to our route, but avoiding the encounter entirely. The loading dock tunnel entrance was a steel fire door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." I swiped my card. The light turned green. The magnetic lock disengaged with a sound like a whispered promise. Beyond it lay 20 meters of concrete tunnel, then daylight. Daylight was an assault. After 18 hours of emergency lighting and sealed rooms, the morning sun felt like a physical force pressing against my retinas. We emerged from the tunnel's mouth into the loading dock, a concrete apron bordered by waste containers and delivery bays, and stood blinking like creatures excavated from deep earth. Zurich was quiet. Not peaceful, quiet, vacant quiet. The silence of a city holding its breath. The street beyond the loading dock perimeter was empty of traffic. Cars sat where they'd been abandoned, doors open, engines off. A tram on Bahnhofstrasse had stopped mid-route, its pantograph still raised, its interior visible through windows that reflected sky instead of passengers. Diego surveyed the scene with military alertness. "Where is everyone?" "Evacuated, dead or turned," Nor said. She was putting her shoes back on, her movements precise, her face revealing nothing. "Pick your ratio." We needed transportation, supplies, and a destination in that order. I knew the immediate area well enough to navigate on foot, but the city's geography presented a problem. Zurich sits in a valley basin around the Limmat River, with elevation rising to the north and east. The FIFA headquarters occupied the city's northwestern sector. If the infection followed population density patterns, and the evidence from other cities suggested it did, the urban core would be the most dangerous zone. We needed to move outward, uphill, away from concentration. Katrine spoke for the first time since we'd left the trophy room. "My sister lives in Kuznacht, across the lake. She has a house with a cellar, and she keeps supplies because she's..." She paused, searching for diplomacy. "Prepared for contingencies." "Your sister's a prepper?" Diego said. "My sister watches too much American television. But right now, I'm grateful for it." Kuznacht was southeast, roughly 8 kilometers following the lake's western shore. On a normal day, it was a 20-minute drive. Today, with the roads choked with abandoned vehicles and an unknown infected population between us and the destination, It could take hours. It could be impossible. But it was a plan, and a plan was something to move toward. We found a delivery van in the loading dock, a white Mercedes Sprinter used for transporting exhibition materials. The keys were in the ignition, left there by a driver who'd either fled on foot or hadn't fled at all. The tank was 3/4 full. I drove. I knew the streets. The first kilometer was navigable. Side streets, residential avenues, the kind of routes that delivery drivers and locals use to avoid main road congestion. We saw infected intermittently singles and pairs, standing on sidewalks or in doorways, their postures uniformly slack until a sound drew their attention. The van's engine was a trigger. Every infected head within earshot rotated toward us as we passed, tracking us with that unsettling mechanical precision. But they didn't pursue. Not yet. We weren't close enough, or loud enough, or slow enough to activate whatever predatory threshold governed their behavior. At the Berkeleyplatz intersection, the road became impassable. A municipal bus had jackknifed across both lanes, and behind it, a compression of vehicles had formed dozens of cars, crushed bumper to bumper in a frozen stampede. I pulled the van onto the sidewalk and navigated around a row of parked bicycles until the sidewalk, too, was blocked by an overturned newspaper kiosk. "On foot from here," I said. "Stay close. Stay quiet." We abandoned the van and moved along the Limmat Quay toward the lake. The river flowed unchanged, indifferent to the catastrophe on its banks. Swans drifted near the shore, preening with casual elegance, organisms too simple to comprehend what had happened to the species that fed them. Their beauty was almost offensive in its obliviousness. The lakeshore path opened ahead of us, a pedestrian walkway bordered by manicured gardens and park benches, curving southeast toward Kuznacht. Under other circumstances, it would have been a pleasant morning walk. The sun was warm, the air smelled of linden trees and lake water. And for brief stretches, with my eyes fixed on the path ahead and the mountains beyond, I could almost forget. Then Layla spotted the figures on the bridge, and forgetting became impossible. The Kaibrücke, the bridge spanning the Limmat where it met the lake, was occupied by a group I initially mistook for infected. They stood in a loose cluster near the bridge's center, roughly a dozen figures, motionless in the morning light. But their postures were wrong for infected, too upright, too varied, lacking that characteristic cervical slump. These were living people. As we approached, a man detached from the group and walked toward us. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a police uniform with the jacket unzipped and no visible weapon. His name tag read Rueg. "How many of you?" he called out, his voice carrying the flat authority of institutional training. "5, I answered. "We came from the FIFA building." "FIFA?" He looked us over: an office worker without shoes, a technician carrying a fire extinguisher, twin archivists, and a facilities coordinator with a pocket knife. His expression suggested he'd been hoping for military. "We're assembling survivors, moving south along the shore to the Wollishofen ferry terminal. There's a boat being held for evacuation." "Held by whom?" "SBB Emergency Services, a lake steamer commandeered for civilian transport. They're running shuttles to the eastern shore, away from the city center." He paused. "There's a capacity limit. First come, first aboard." The bridge group was a mixture of civilians, office workers, a mother with 2 young children, an elderly couple supporting each other with trembling arms, a man in a chef's coat still carrying a kitchen towel. Fear had democratized them. Profession, status, nationality, all dissolved in the universal acid of survival. We joined the group, and Rueg led us south along the lakefront at a pace dictated by the slowest members. The elderly man, introduced by his wife as Alois, moved with the determined shuffle of someone for whom every step was a negotiation with pain. His wife, Margaret, murmured encouragement in Swiss German, her hand on his elbow, her eyes scanning the path ahead with a vigilance that suggested she'd survived other catastrophes, other eras of European dissolution. The lakefront was intermittently dangerous. We encountered infected at 3 points during the 1.5-kilometer walk to Wollishofen. The first was a lone figure standing ankle-deep in the lake's shallows, facing the water. Motionless, an image so surreal, it looked composed, like an art installation about the end of meaning. It didn't react to our passage. The second encounter was more serious. A group of 4 emerged from a waterfront restaurant as we passed, drawn by the sound of one of the children crying. Reg's response was immediate and coordinated. He directed 2 younger men from our group to create a noise diversion, banging on a metal railing 50 meters away while the rest of us moved quickly past. The infected oriented toward the sound, their bodies pivoting with that unsettling unanimity. And we gained enough distance to round a bend and break their line of perception. The third encounter cost us Alois. It happened at a narrow section where the path squeezed between a boathouse and a stone retaining wall. A single infected stood in the gap, a young woman in athletic clothing, her face untouched, almost peaceful. Only the vacancy of her gaze, revealing what she'd become. Rueg tried to guide the group around her through the boathouse, but the interior door was locked, and the delay compressed us into a tight cluster that produced exactly the kind of noise concentration the infected responded to. She lunged, not at the nearest person, but at movement, Alois stumbling on a raised paving stone, his cane striking the ground with a sharp crack. Margaret screamed, and Diego swung the fire extinguisher with the full torque of his shoulders. The impact redirected the infected woman into the retaining wall, but Alois had fallen. His wrist showed a wound not deep, not immediately dangerous, but the skin was broken, and the implications were understood by everyone who saw it. Margaret knelt beside him. Alois looked at his wrist, then at his wife, and said something in German I didn't catch, but understood from the shape of his expression. The group kept moving. Margaret helped Alois to his feet. Nobody discussed what the wound meant. Not yet. The Wollishofen ferry terminal was a modest concrete pier extending into the lake, equipped with a waiting shelter and a boarding ramp designed for the flat-bottomed passenger steamers that served Zurich's commuter routes. When we arrived, the steamer was there, a white vessel with the ZSG logo on its hull, engines idling, its deck already crowded with evacuees. A woman in a high-visibility vest stood at the boarding ramp with a clipboard, performing the most absurd act of bureaucratic normalcy I'd witnessed since the outbreak. She was counting heads. "How many in your group?" she asked Reg. He counted. 17. She consulted her clipboard, performed a calculation that involved frowning at the vessel and then at the crowd, and shook her head. "I can take 12. The vessel's rated for 140. We're at 131. These are people, not cargo weights. And that's a boat, not a miracle. 12. The negotiation lasted 4 minutes. In those minutes, the group's unity, forged by shared terror over the preceding hour, fractured along lines of predictable self-interest. The mother with children argued priority. Rueg argued for a uniform policy. Diego argued that the capacity rating was conservative and all 17 could board safely. The woman with the clipboard held her position with the immovable certainty of someone who'd been given one job and intended to do it perfectly even as civilization collapsed around her. I watched the argument and felt the first stirring of something that would define the weeks ahead. the recognition that survival was not cooperative by default. It required cooperation, but it did not generate it. Fear generated selfishness, or with the same reliability that heat generated sweat. The decision about who would board and who would wait for the next shuttle if there was a next shuttle was not a logistical problem. It was a moral audition. Noor stepped out of the argument. She walked to Margaret and Alois, who stood apart from the group, Alois cradling his wounded wrist, Margaret's arm around his waist. Noor spoke to them quietly, and I saw Alois shake his head. Then Margaret spoke, and Noor's expression shifted into something I couldn't read. She returned to me. Alois won't board. He says he knows what the bite means. He's asking to stay behind. And Margaret? She's staying with him. The decision redistributed the arithmetic. Without Alois and Margaret, 15 people needed 12 spots. The mother with children took 2 slots. Rueg assigned the remaining 10 by a system that prioritized injury, age, and group coherence. Our group of 5 was split. Katrine, Noor, and Layla boarded. Diego and I were assigned to the next shuttle, promised within the hour. I watched Katrin walk up the ramp without looking back. Noor paused at the top, turned, and met my eyes across the distance. She didn't wave or speak. She simply held the contact for 3 seconds, long enough to transfer something wordless but permanent, and then she turned and disappeared into the crowd on deck. The steamer departed at 9:47 a.m. I stood on the pier and watched it pull away, its wake spreading across the lake's surface in diverging lines, carrying people I'd kept alive into a distance I couldn't follow. Diego stood beside me. 1 hour, he said. That's what she said. You believe it? I looked at the woman with the clipboard. She was already on a radio, speaking rapidly in German, her face tight with the particular stress of someone juggling commitments she wasn't certain she could honor. Behind her, on the lakeshore path, I could see figures approaching more survivors, drawn by the same information network that had guided us here. A chain of whispered directions and pointed fingers that had temporarily replaced all institutional communication. And behind them, further up the path, moving with that distinctive arrhythmic gait, other figures. I believe she's trying, I said. Alois and Margaret had seated themselves on a bench overlooking the water. They sat close, holding hands, watching the steamer shrink toward the eastern shore. Whatever conversation they were having was private, final, and not mine to witness. I looked away and began counting the approaching survivors, trying to calculate how many the next shuttle could carry and whether any of us would be among them. The next shuttle never came. At 10:30 a.m., the radio on the clipboard woman's belt produced a burst of static, followed by a voice I couldn't translate, but whose tone was unmistakable. She listened, responded, listened again. When she lowered the radio, her expression had undergone a transformation, the professional composure replaced by something rawer, younger, the face beneath the function. The Eastern Shore terminal is overrun, she said, addressing no one in particular. They're pulling the steamer out of service. The pier held 23 people at that point. Diego and me, Rueg, Alois and Margaret on their bench. The clipboard woman, whose name, I learned, was Sabine, and 17 new arrivals in various states of shock, injury, and despair. 23 people on a concrete finger extending into a lake they could no longer cross. Rueg assumed command by default. His training surfaced like a submarine, breaching water suddenly visible, structured, reassuring. He organized the group, assessed injuries, designated roles. 2 men who identified as former military were assigned perimeter watch on the pier's landward end. A woman who'd been a nurse before the outbreak began treating a teenager with a gash across his forearm. Diego was recruited for physical labor moving benches, building a barricade across the pier's narrowest point using planters and waste bins. I was given a different task. Sabine had a marine radio tuned to the emergency coordination frequency, and she needed someone who understood infrastructure to monitor communications and map reported safe zones. I sat beside her in the ferry shelter, listening to fragmented transmissions that painted a picture of concentric collapse. The infection had reached every district. Emergency services were overwhelmed, redirecting to triage operations rather than containment. The Swiss military had established a perimeter around the Bundeshaus in Bern, but Zurich was classified as compromised. Evacuation corridors existed theoretically along the A3 motorway heading south toward the Alps. But traffic was gridlocked, and multiple accidents had created impassable blockages. What struck me was the language. The transmissions used terminology I recognized from disaster response manuals. Containment zones, resource allocation, population management. Bureaucratic vocabulary applied to an unbureaucratic reality. The infection didn't respect zones. The dead didn't respond to allocation. The language was a comfort mechanism, a way for institutions to pretend they still controlled the grammar of events. By noon, the pier's situation had stabilized into a temporary equilibrium. The barricade at the landward end was crude but functional, heavy enough to delay any infected approach, narrow enough to funnel single-file passage. Rueg's perimeter watchers reported intermittent infected activity on the lakeshore path, but no organized movement toward the pier. We were visible, but apparently not interesting enough to attract sustained attention. The more pressing problem was Alois. His wrist wound had stopped bleeding, but the skin around it had begun to change, a darkening that started at the edges and crept inward, as if the tissue were being stained from beneath. He showed no behavioral symptoms yet. His speech was clear, his eyes focused, his cognition intact. But everyone on the pier understood the timeline. The transmissions I'd monitored mentioned onset windows ranging from 6 to 14 hours depending on wound severity and individual immune response. Margaret had not left his side. She'd fashioned a bandage from her scarf and wrapped his wrist with the tenderness of someone dressing a sleeping child. Alois watched her work with an expression that combined gratitude, grief, and the particular sorrow of a person who understands they are becoming a burden to someone they love. Rueg approached me at 1 p.m. His face carried the weight of a decision he'd already made, but hadn't yet spoken. "The old man," he said. "I know. We can't have him here when it happens." "What are you proposing?" "I'm not proposing anything. I'm asking you as someone who knows infrastructure if there's a room, a space, somewhere we can move him, somewhere contained." I looked at the ferry terminal building, a small structure ticket office, waiting room, restroom, solid walls, locking doors, a space designed for temporary occupation, now repurposed for a different kind of waiting. "I can make it work," I said, "but someone needs to tell Margaret." "I know," Rugg said, and the way he said it told me he'd already decided who that someone would be. I told Margaret. Rueg stood beside me, a silent authority figure lending institutional weight to what was, at its core, a human sentence delivered to a woman about her husband. I explained the necessity in terms that were honest without being cruel. The transformation was coming. We couldn't predict when. And the safety of the group required containment. Alois could be moved to the terminal building's ticket office, a small room with a lockable door, a bench, a window that would let in light and air. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at Alois, who was watching the lake with the distant focus of someone already beginning their departure from the present. "He knows," she said. "We discussed it this morning. He suggested it before you did." She paused. "May I stay with him?" I looked at Rugg. His expression was the mask of a man whose training had prepared him for scenarios, but not for this particular human question. The protocol answer was no. You don't lock a healthy person in a room with someone transitioning. The human answer was more complicated, tangled in the roots of a partnership that had likely spanned decades. "Until the symptoms appear," Rugg said. "Then you come out. Agreed?" She agreed. We moved them together, Alois leaning on Margaret, both walking with the careful dignity of people performing their final shared act. I opened the ticket office, cleared the space of furniture except for the bench, and ensured the door's lock functioned from the outside. Inside, the room was warm and bright, sunlight falling through the window in a clean rectangle that landed on the bench like a stage light. Alois sat. Margaret sat beside him. Through the window, they had a view of the lake, the mountains, the sky, a panorama of Swiss beauty that had graced 1,000 postcards and now served as the backdrop for an intimate devastation. I closed the door but didn't lock it. Not yet. That would come later, and someone else would have to do it, because I knew with absolute certainty that I could not. The afternoon unfolded in the peculiar temporal distortion of survival hours that felt like days punctuated by minutes that moved like seconds. The peer community developed rhythms. Watch rotations, meal distributions, scavenged from the terminal's vending machines and nearby restaurants. Sleeping schedules. Diego became the de facto physical leader, his energy and confidence drawing people into organized action. Ruig handled strategy and communication. I managed infrastructure, the radio, the building, the mechanical systems that kept our micro-society functional. At 3 p.m., Sabine intercepted a transmission that changed everything. A coordinated military evacuation was being organized from Rapperswil at the lake's southeastern tip. Helicopters, ground transport, a designated safe corridor to a military installation in the Alps. The transmission listed specific pickup times and locations. It was organized, detailed, and verifiable across multiple frequencies. Rapperswil was 30 kilometers southeast along the lake. By road, if roads were passable, it was an hour's drive under normal conditions. By water, following the shoreline, it was approximately the same distance. The ferry terminal had no operational vessels. But the marina adjacent to the pier held private boats, sailboats, motorboats, recreational craft in various states of readiness. Diego and I surveyed the marina. Most boats were locked, keyed, or damaged. But one, a 7-meter aluminum motorboat with an outboard engine, sat in its berth with the ignition key dangling from a carabiner clipped to the steering column. Its owner had either intended to return or had left in such haste that security was irrelevant. The fuel tank was half full, enough by my rough calculation for the 30-kilometer journey if we maintained moderate speed. The boat could carry 8 people safely. The pier held 23. This was the arithmetic that survival demanded. Not the clean mathematics of resource management, but the brutal arithmetic of selection. Who goes? Who stays? Who decides? And by what authority? I stared at the boat, its aluminum hull catching afternoon sun, and felt the moral architecture of my pre-outbreak life. Fairness, equity, due process begin to buckle under the weight of a number that was too small for the need it had to serve. The argument lasted 2 hours. I've replayed it in my mind hundreds of times since, and each replay reveals different fault lines, different moments where the outcome could have shifted. Rugg proposed a selection system based on physical capability and strategic value, essentially, those most likely to survive the journey and contribute to the group afterward. Diego argued for a lottery pure chance, morally neutral, immune to the corruption of subjective judgment. The nurse, her name was Petra, argued medical priority. The teenager with the gash. A woman showing early signs of dehydration. A man with what she suspected was a fractured rib. Sabine said nothing during the debate. She sat with her clipboard and her radio, watching the group fracture along the very lines she'd seen fracture at the boarding ramp hours earlier. When the argument reached its peak, two men shouting, a woman crying, the teenager sitting apart with the expression of someone who'd aged 5 years in a day. Sabine stood and walked to the edge of the pier. "We take 2 trips," she said over her shoulder. The group went silent. The boat holds 8. Rapperswil is approximately 90 minutes each way at conservative speed. First group departs now, arrives by sunset. Boat returns by morning. Second group boards then. "Returns with who driving?" Reg asked. "I will." Diego stepped forward. "I drive the first group, dock at Rapperswil, refuel if possible, return overnight." The plan was logical, feasible, and dependent on a single fragile assumption: that Diego would return. That after reaching safety, after delivering himself and 7 others to a military evacuation point, he would climb back into a small boat, navigate 30 kilometers of dark lake, and come back for the rest of us. I watched the group process this. Trust, real trust, not the performative variety of office team-building exercises, was being asked of people who had no reason to trust anyone. Diego was a stranger to most of them. An Argentine technician visiting a Swiss office building caught in someone else's apocalypse. What bond did he have to this pier, these people, this promise? Diego seemed to read the doubt. He turned to me, and his eyes held a directness I'd seen in very few people, the transparency of a man whose integrity was structural, not decorative. "Joel comes with me on the first trip, and he stays at Rapperswil while I return. If I don't come back, he can find another way to get you." It was an imperfect guarantee, but it was enough. Ruig organized the first group, Diego and me, the mother with her 2 children, the teenager, Petra the nurse, and a young couple who'd been clinging to each other since arriving on the pier. 8 people. The remaining 15 would wait through the night for a return that might never come. Before we departed, I went to the ticket office. Through the window, I could see Margaret sitting beside Alois. He was asleep, or appeared to be, his head resting against the wall, his wounded wrist cradled in his lap. The darkening had spread past the bandage, visible now along his forearm, an invasion mapped in discoloration. Margaret saw me at the window and came to the door. "You're leaving?" "Some of us, by boat. There's a military evacuation at Rapperswil." "Go." She said it without hesitation or resentment. "Go and be safe." "Margaret?" "He's sleeping more. When he's awake, he's confused. He called me by his mother's name an hour ago." She was reporting this with clinical detachment, but her hands shook as she gripped the door frame. "I'll lock the door when it's time. I know what to do." I wanted to say something adequate, something that matched the magnitude of what she was undertaking to stand vigil over her husband's dissolution and then imprison the thing he became. No sentence in any language I spoke was sufficient. I touched her hand briefly, inadequately, and walked back to the pier. Diego had the engine running. The aluminum hull bobbed gently against the dock. I stepped aboard, and we cast off into a lake that reflected the mountains and the sky and nothing of what was happening on its shores. The lake crossing was the most peaceful 90 minutes I'd experienced since the outbreak. Water is indifferent to catastrophe in a way that land cannot be. It erases footprints, carries no bodies for long, reflects whatever sky is offered without editorial comment. The boat cut a clean line through the surface, and the engine's steady drone created a white noise cocoon that insulated us from the silence of the shore. The mother, her name was Annika, sat in the bow with her children, a boy of perhaps 4 and a girl of 6. The children watched the water with the fascination of young minds, for whom novelty still outweighed fear. The boy trailed his fingers in the lake, creating small wakes that merged with the boat's larger disturbance. The girl pointed at a distant sail and said something to her mother in a language I didn't recognize. Diego drove with competent focus, keeping the boat parallel to the southern shore at a distance of roughly 200 meters, close enough to navigate by landmark, far enough to avoid anything on the waterline. The teenager, his name was Jonas, sat beside me, his bandaged forearm resting on his knee, his eyes fixed on the retreating cityscape of Zurich. "My parents were in Oerlikon," he said. It was the first complete sentence I'd heard him speak. "North Side. I was at school when it started. I never got home." I didn't offer false hope. The North Side had been among the first areas overwhelmed, according to the radio transmissions. Oerlikon was dense, residential, the kind of neighborhood where infection would propagate through apartment buildings like fire through dry timber. "When we reach Rapperswil," I said, "there will be communication systems, lists of survivors, ways to search." He nodded, accepting this partial truth with the resignation of someone who understood that communication systems and survivor lists were aspirational concepts in a world where the systems that maintained them had collapsed. Rapperswil emerged from the lake's eastern haze at 6:15 p.m., a medieval town anchored by a castle on a hill, its waterfront lined with historic buildings that looked, from our approach, entirely untouched. The illusion held until we rounded the breakwater and saw the military presence. 2 helicopters on a makeshift landing pad in the castle's parking area, armored vehicles on the quay, soldiers in hazmat-adjacent tactical gear directing civilians along roped corridors toward processing tents. We docked at the municipal pier, and a soldier met us before we'd tied off. His manner was efficient and impersonal. Name, origin point, injury status, exposure history. Each answer was entered into a tablet, and I caught a glimpse of the database behind his form. Thousands of entries, a digital census of the surviving. Processing took 40 minutes. We were separated by medical status. Petra and Jonas directed to a treatment tent, the rest of us to a holding area where we were given water, protein bars, and foil blankets. The holding area was a conference room in the Rapperswil Town Hall, repurposed with military cots and temporary lighting. Perhaps 60 people occupied the space, sitting or lying in the particular posture of the recently saved bodies, relaxed, eyes still vigilant. The disconnect between physical safety and psychological acceptance. Diego found me at 7 p.m. "I'm taking the boat back tonight. Refueled at the military dock. They gave me a marine spotlight and a radio. You don't have to do this. 15 people on a pier, Joel. I told them I'd come back. The lake at night, alone. If the motor fails, then I drift until morning and try again." He extended his hand. His palm was calloused, warm, steady. "Keep the radio on frequency 7. I'll transmit when I'm 30 minutes out from the pier. If you don't hear from me by noon tomorrow, assume the worst and find another way." I shook his hand. The grip was a contract, a compression of trust into flesh and bone. He walked back to the dock, and I watched from the town hall window as the boat's spotlight cut a white line across the darkening lake, growing smaller, dimmer, until it was indistinguishable from the first stars reflecting on the water. I didn't sleep. The cot was adequate, the room was warm, the sounds of other survivors breathing and shifting created an ambient rhythm that should have lulled me under. but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pier 15 people waiting. Margaret in her ticket office, Alois's arm darkening, the barricade of planters and waste bins that suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate. And somewhere on the Black Lake, Diego in a small boat with a spotlight and a promise. I kept the radio on frequency 7, volume low, pressed against my ear. Static, ambient noise, the occasional fragment of military communication bleeding through from adjacent frequencies. Nothing from Diego. At 2 a.m., I walked to the processing center and asked to access the survivor database. The soldier on duty was reluctant. The database was restricted, he said. Operational security, but a ranking officer overheard and intervened. Let him look. Everyone's looking for someone. The database was extensive and growing. Names, origins, dates of registration, medical status. I searched for Noor Kadira and found her registered at the Eastern Shore Terminal at 10:32 a.m. Status: evacuated to secondary processing. Layla Kadira, same entry, same time. Katrine Hofer, registered at 10:34 a.m., same status. The steamer had delivered them safely. 3 people I'd guided through a dead building were alive and accounted for. I searched for Greta Volz, my supervisor. No entry. Marcus Brandt, the security officer. No entry. Henrik, the night janitor. No entry. The absences were a negative portrait, the outline of people defined by their removal from the record. I searched for my own name and found it, entered during processing. Joel Mancini, FIFA Zurich, registered 1847, status active. A single line in a database that had become the closest thing to an official record of human existence. If your name was there, you were real. If it wasn't, you were either dead, turned, or so far beyond institutional reach that the distinction hardly mattered. At 4 a.m., the radio crackled. A voice, Diego's voice, distorted by distance and atmospheric interference, but unmistakable in its cadence, broke through the static. Joel, frequency 7. I'm at the pier. 15 accounted for. Loading now. Departing in 20 minutes. Conditions calm. ET a sunrise. I pressed the transmit button. Copy, received, safe crossing. Tell them to have coffee ready. The transmission ended. I sat in the dark, holding the radio, and felt something I hadn't felt since the outbreak began. Not hope exactly, but its precursor, the physiological preparation for hope, the body's way of clearing space for an emotion it had temporarily archived. At 6:30 a.m., the boat appeared on the lake. I was standing on the Rapperswil Quay, and I saw the spotlight first, unnecessary now in the growing dawn, but still burning. A beacon that said I kept my word in the visual language of light across water. As it approached, I could count figures on deck. 15. Diego at the helm, upright, steady, navigating the final meters with the careful precision of a man completing a sacred task. They docked. The 15 disembarked in the particular way of people stepping off a vessel they never expected to board, tentative, grateful, slightly disbelieving. Ruig was among them, his police uniform now wrinkled and salt-stained. His authority transferred from institutional to personal over the course of a single night's waiting. Sabine followed, clipboard gone, radio gone, carrying nothing but herself. Margaret was not among them. I found Diego after the disembarkation. He was tying the boat to the dock with knots that spoke of maritime experience I hadn't known he possessed. His face was drawn, the shadows under his eyes the topography of a sleepless night on open water. "Margaret?" I asked. He finished the knot before answering. She locked the ticket office door from the outside. Alois was he wasn't Alois anymore. She sat on the bench outside the door all night. When I arrived, she said she'd done what needed doing and she'd wait with him until it was finished. He looked at me. She wouldn't board, Joel. I asked 3 times. The military evacuation from Rapperswil proceeded with the organized efficiency of a system designed for exactly this kind of collapse. Helicopters lifted groups of 20 to a staging facility near Andermatt, deep in the Alpine corridor, where the elevation, the narrow valley approaches, and the winter infrastructure created natural defensive advantages. I boarded the 3rd helicopter at 9 a.m., squeezed between Jonas and a woman holding a cat carrier. The aircraft rose above the lake, and through the window, I watched Rapperswil shrink the castle, the quay, the boats becoming a postcard of a place I'd likely never return to. The facility was a repurposed military installation from the Cold War, built into the mountainside with black doors and ventilation systems that made the FIFA trophy room look like a garden shed. Inside, the Swiss government had established a functioning micro-society. Medical facilities, food distribution, communication centers, sleeping quarters organized by family unit and registration number. It was regimented, impersonal, and utterly reliable, the Swiss national character distilled into survival infrastructure. I was assigned to technical services within hours. My facility's background translated directly into the maintenance demands of a bunker housing 3,000 people. I repaired ventilation ducts, maintained water purification systems, and calibrated the backup generators that kept the installation operational. The work was consuming, physical, and precisely what I needed a structure to inhabit while my mind processed what I'd witnessed. Diego was assigned to external operations, leading supply runs to abandoned towns in the valley below. His return trips became the heartbeat of the facility's morale. Each successful run proving that the outside world was navigable, that resources existed, that the infected, while present, were not omnipotent. He developed techniques for movement, evasion, and silent extraction that were eventually formalized into training protocols distributed to other installations. Noor and Layla arrived at Andermatt 3 days after I did, transferred from the Eastern Shore Processing Center. The reunion was quiet, a brief embrace in a corridor outside the mess hall. The kind of physical contact that communicated more than any debriefing could. Noor had changed. The archival calmness was still there, but it had been tempered by something harder, an alloy of experience and resolve that showed in the way she carried herself. "We made it," she said. A simple declarative sentence that contained the entire spectrum of survival, the luck, the loss, the arbitrary mathematics of who lived and who didn't. Katrine was at a different facility, we learned. Transferred south to a medical installation near Lugano. She'd suffered a breakdown during processing, not unusual, the medical staff told us, not uncommon among survivors who'd maintained composure through the acute phase and then collapsed when safety removed the structural necessity of control. She would recover, they said, with the careful optimism of professionals who understood that recovery was a word with multiple definitions. Jonas found his mother. She'd been registered at a facility near Lucerne, evacuated from Oerlikon in the first hours of the military response. His father was not in the database. Jonas absorbed this information with the stoic efficiency of a teenager who'd already learned, in the space of days, that grief was a luxury to be deferred. I thought about Margaret often, the image of her sitting on a bench outside a locked door, keeping vigil over a husband who had become something other than her husband, staying by choice when departure was offered. This image became the moral center of my memory. Not heroism, not sacrifice, but fidelity to a bond that transcended the biological boundary the infection imposed. She had refused to abandon Alois even after Alois was gone. Because her commitment was not to his body or his mind, but to something more fundamental, the accumulated weight of shared years, the architecture of a life built in partnership, the refusal to let that architecture fall without a witness. I never learned what happened to her. The pier was not revisited by any operation I was aware of. Wollishofen remained in the red zone for months. But I carried her decision with me the way others carried photographs or keepsakes, a portable monument to what love looked like when it was stripped of every comfort except its own stubborn persistence. 7 months have passed. The installation at Andermatt has become a permanent settlement, one of 11 across the Alpine corridor. The infection persists in the lowlands, but the mountains hold. We've learned to live within the parameters of elevation and vigilance. I returned to Zurich once with a military survey team. The FIFA building stood intact, its glass facade reflecting a city slowly being reclaimed by weather and vegetation. I didn't enter. I didn't need to. The trophy room was just a room now. Concrete and glass and gold-plated objects that meant everything to a world that no longer existed, and nothing to the world that replaced it. What I carried out of that room wasn't survival. Survival is mechanics movement, resource acquisition, threat avoidance. What I carried out was the understanding that crisis doesn't reveal character so much as it generates it. The person I was before the outbreak, the facilities coordinator, the maintenance scheduler, the man who oiled door hinges and calibrated climate systems, didn't survive. He was replaced, incrementally, by someone shaped in the kiln of consequence. Margaret taught me that. Diego confirmed it. Noor embodied it. We are not who we were. We are what we chose when choosing was all we had left.